lectures on the American innovation ecosystem. Last time we had built up to the very early days, and then post World War II with the innovation of Bush, which was first to invest in the 30s, have the nation state invest quite a bit of treasure into technology, and then continue that process outside from underneath the DoD as well as within the DoD post-World War II. Now we're going to talk about the more modern phases where, with that establishment, our evolution into what my co-author in the book, Carl Schramm, called Bureaucratic Capitalism and Entrepreneurial Capitalism. What I'll do here is argue that our phase of entrepreneurial capitalism as we knew it is actually rolling over with our innovation paradigm ending, and that we're looking at the collapse of our previous innovation ecosystem, and that has caused slow growth really post 2000, and not doing the things that we need to, or I would say that what we're doing are the natural processes after any high growth phase, high growth part of the innovation paradigm that happens, where people try to keep it going, but ultimately what's happening in the background is the establishment of a new ecosystem, which we after the corrective cycles. But let's talk about that evolution now. So you recall last time we were at the point where Vannevar Bush had done this, and big investments now were happening post-World War II in technology, in particular the university system in the United States, which had been established, and then we created these technical institutions like MIT from the Morrill Act. They were receiving a lot of new resources to build new programs. For example, my field, material science and engineering, was one that appeared quite late, and really in the 50s and the 60s is when they started realizing that discipline should appear at various universities, and was really built, the plan for that was being built in the 50s. But anyway, all sorts of investment occurring in order to accomplish that. So now you have to think about where we were in 1950. Important aspect here, which is Europe essentially have infrastructure. So something that I don't think that we fully appreciated. Yes, from the early days you can see that America's timing in terms of being geographically isolated and being discovered late, when the errors of, not errors, but the learning of how societies can be built and how governments can be built. For example, when America was formed, we're not thinking about making kings. Everybody kind of knew that was not the thing to do, even though it was like, oh, George Washington could be king. He knew enough not to do that. The other advantage of geographic isolation is that it was very difficult in the war for Japan and U.S. infrastructure. So again, this kind of just historical and geographical advantage came out again because America was the only game in town. So essentially what we have is Bush's investment, and you combine that with a monopoly and you essentially have the U.S. innovation ecosystem. So while Europe and Japan are rebuilding, the other problem is that Britain is bankrupt and destroyed. So its infrastructure is destroyed, and it lost most of its treasure. So the U.S. was positioned for a unique thing, and each company that ended up dominating the U.S. market, and I don't mean to pretend there wasn't competition, but very quickly each winner in the American market became the winner globally. So, for example, Kodak had a monopoly, a monopoly in film. IBM in office equipment, and then computers. And these companies, they had competition, but they dominated their end markets. I mean, Kodak pretty much made film at 1,000 times the cost of paper, or something like that. So, huge margins, right? Xerox eventually became, copier, and so on. And HP, is instrumentation, electronic instrumentation, and so on. And now the advantage of having these captured markets is, remember, the market uncertainty disappears, right? So if I know that the advance is going to come into affecting film, for example, then there's no competitors, and I win if I'm Kodak, right? So what's interesting is, this kind of breakup of the economy into these different segments. And by the way, people couldn't see that this wouldn't be there forever. By the time the 70s came around, you see, even science fiction stories in popular America that talk about how the current world, the future world, will be run by these, corporations in the United States that divide up the country and stuff like that. So people really had this view about, I don't think people really connected it at the time to the fact that there were these two things going on. I mean, I think most people didn't even know about Bush's and the United States investing in R&D the way they did, combined with the fact that these companies didn't have any initial competition anyway. So what this did was, let's imagine you're Kodak and you want to hold your position. So you invest dollars out a little bit further, let's say, beyond incremental innovation. And guess what that does? It returns even more. Right? These are in times of tight capital too. So, post-war II, it's times of tight capital. There's no venture, there's no nothing. So you generate your own money. So by being a market position, by holding a market dominant position, you essentially have created your own bank as well. So you basically create your own cash and reinvest it in yourself. And what this does is, if I look at, sort of time into the future, I actually go way out into the future, and now I start dropping dollars way out here in basic, what was called basic research, which we would call fundamental innovation. And that's where all the labs came from. Bell Labs was created in the 20s, but really took off post-World War II. And so this makes perfect sense, right? Because in our market implementation technology iteration, the market uncertainty is only an internal thing. It's not external. Like, for example, at least in film, Kodak doesn't have to worry about it, right? So you generally place bets in sort of physical sciences because, as you go further and further out, you need to know more about silver. For example, they covered silver halide chemistry, which is the chemistry in film. They made sure that they knew they were the leaders in every bit of technical information, science research related to anything with science halide film. I mean, it's one thing. And, obviously keep on investing, so the further you invest, the less relevant it becomes. But this created, way out here, a science commons that overlapped with the university. The reason you could have a science commons is that really, even if that didn't benefit Kodak directly, and some of it did, but IBM benefited from information that was created, right? And so did Xerox, right? So what you had is that these companies didn't mind the furthest out research actually being shared at research conferences. So, for example, when I first started in the 80s, my graduate research, when I was a graduate student in my research, I go to conferences, and the conferences I would attend typically had as many industrial researchers there as university folks. And it's hard to imagine today, because today it's 90% university folks, which we're going to see why that changed. So this was a world in which the stronger got stronger, but they also created environments for great fundamental innovation, because like we showed in the previous lecture series, that they had all the components, market, implementation, technology, in order to create fundamental innovation. But remember that they're fixated on their end markets that they dominate. So if that technology needed to migrate through more uncertainty in market application and implementation, at the end of the process, you couldn't do it, because Kodak was about film, right? So it's very difficult to follow the innovation path the way it should, and so many things get left on the shelf. And of course, by this time, again, we're bringing in Carl Schramm's terminology, bureaucratic capitalism. Now, remember, it wasn't bureaucratic until the end, and we started thinking about it as bureaucratic capitalism. It was market-dominant, innovative companies for the first part, right? And but yes, by the time they became bureaucratic capitalists, they were investing far out, had huge research labs that clearly weren't going to create its market position, and of course, competition started coming in. And so that's the next phase. Oh, this is a little picture. This is a great picture of the large corporate labs. This one actually is Bell Laboratories. And I love this picture because actually I remember this hallway. It's in the older building. I was in a newer building next door, but just rows and rows of labs, and basically in a new building, I was one of these folks able to discover a strained silicon. But this is really a result of that process. A natural evolution of that process. Now, you got to remember, all the time people think about this as static situations. So 30 years, there's a lot of people that live that entire time, cradle to grave. So, we have sort of the World War II generation is seeing that, okay, we won the war, now we've created a very stable environment. But the truth is, as we know now, this is all a temporary situation. But when I went to Bell Labs, everybody thought I would work there. I remember when I went there, all my relatives were like, oh, that's fantastic. You'll be able to do all that great stuff at Bell Labs, and you'll be there your whole life or whatever.